Oh, just smoking a little bowl of kiff here. Wonderful stuff in my antique Ottoman Empire tip here with my Moroccan kiff pipe. I showed you in an earlier episode of the Burning Shiva. Today in the Burning Shiva Hour, we're going to be talking about the hidden hashish masters of the 19th century. Now, I've touched on a couple of these individuals before in an earlier episode I did on the Burning Shiva Hour, Illuminatis, Freemasons, and other hash heads. But I've come across some more information on some of these people, so I thought I'd discuss a little further in depth some little-known individuals who were major players in the occult grounds of the 19th century who were hashish devotees. It's interesting because in the 19th century, with the development of Darwin's theory of evolution, religious ideas were challenged like never before in history. And many people started, questioning the relevance of the Bible and stuff like that. And this whole spiritualism movement arose. This is the table rapping and the seances and all that type of stuff. And it's interesting that this type of stuff, which was probably more traditionally found in shamanic tribal scenarios earlier than in with Americans in 19th century England and Europe and stuff like that. But it's interesting to note that even in this area of religious renovation, we find evidence of hashish playing a very keen role. Now, I could discuss, more well-known individuals like Fitzhugh Ludlow, whose famous book, The Hashish Eater, is available in a number of different copies and excerpted in numerous books. But because he's so well-known, and I've already read excerpts from him, you can check out an earlier episode of the Hashish Club, where I read excerpts from Fitzhugh Ludlow's book, The Hashish Eater, if you want to find out about him. As well, there's the members of the Hashish Club in Paris, which included people like Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, Théophile Gautier, Balzac, and many famous writers. I'm only going to discuss one of those guys today, Gerard de Nerval, because he was particularly steeped in occult lore and was a real devotee of hashish's occult powers. And then I'm going to discuss Helena Blavatsky. She is the founder of the Theosophical Society, and although the Theosophical Society, which still exists today, doesn't like to acknowledge it, as we'll discuss, Blavatsky herself was indeed a devotee of hashish. Then I'm going to discuss Louise Alphonse Cahagnet, whose 1850 book, The Sanctuary of Spiritualism, is probably one of the greatest works regarding the use of hashish produced in the 19th century. And finally, we'll take a look at Paschal Beverly Randolph, a half-black American Negro who lived from 1825 to 1875, was likely the first commercial importer of hashish into the United States of America, who was a Rosicrucian and a sex magician as well as a hashish devotee. So hang around, check it out. I hope you're going to like this episode of the Burning Shiva Hour. One of the most fascinating occult figures of the 19th century has to be Helena Petrova Blavatsky, who lived from 1831 to 1891. Born in Russia, she married and took off on a Russian count early in her life. Worked as a circus acrobat, riding on horses and whatnot for some years, and then decided to start traveling the world, and traveled all through the Arabian countries as well as Europe, and for a while was in America. In fact, she was there during the beginnings of what became known as the spiritualist movement, where the seances and the table rapping came on. Blavatsky, when the spiritualism things started kind of dying out and people started, not really believing in it anymore, she moved on to the more developed philosophical system of occultism. And this really, she took a lot of this into her world travels and stuff like that, going to places like India and Asia, and familiarizing herself with Hinduism and Buddhism, and also familiarizing herself with even older traditions such as the Babylonians and the Gnostics and stuff like that. Blavatsky is widely credited with bringing ideas like reincarnation and karma to the West from the East. As part of this, she formed a group that's still in existence, the Theosophical Society, and it basically teaches her philosophy to this day. I first heard about Blavatsky's use of hashish in Colin Wilson's The Occult. And other books have dealt with it, such as this one here, The Magic Eyes. There's a chapter in this book, The Haschisch Eater, which details Blavatsky's use of hashish. Other writers, such as Benjamin Walker, who noted that Blavatsky, wrote sometimes under the influence of hashish, several books filled with esoteric lore, which owed a great deal to Hindu and Buddhist systems of thought, and brought to public awareness in the West such concepts of karma, prana, kundalini, yoga, and reincarnation. And that's from Benjamin Walker's Tantrisms and Secret Principles and Practices. Other people that knew her, such as Hannah Wolf, wrote that about Blavatsky's use of cannabis and other substances. It was evident from the first that she smoked tobacco to great excess, frequently as much as a pound a day. I soon learned also that she was addicted to the use of hashish. She several times endeavored to persuade me to try the effect upon myself. She said she had smoked opium, seen its visions, and dreamed its dreams, but that the beatitudes enjoyed in the use of hashish were as heaven to its hell. She said she found nothing to compare with its effect in arousing and stimulating the imagination. In the early 1990s, I was, researching cannabis and religion and stuff like that, material that led to my books and whatnot, and I had included Blavatsky on this poster I did, which I'll show you here, and on a list of cannabis users in relation to religious use, with Jesus and Bob Marley and Zoroaster and other figures. And somehow the Theosophical Society, which was I was saying is still in existence, and which Blavatsky started, found out about this, and they contacted me and threatened to sue me. And I said, well, I found this out in other books and whatnot. And they said, oh, well, there's only one account of people saying Blavatsky used hashish, and it comes from this guy of A.L. Ross. And I said, well, in the interest of truth, then, you need to let me see that. And so they did. They sent me an actual old article written by this guy, A.L. Rawson. And it's really fascinating what he said, because, in fact, A.L. Rawson knew Blavatsky for over 40 years and was probably one of her closest associates and friends. And in fact, as I'll detail here, the Blavatsky herself, in one of her main books, The Secret Doctrine, talked about what a legitimate source Rawson was. So it's pretty interesting to note, and I'll tell you that information now. This is quoting A.L. Rawson. She had tried hashish in Cairo with success, and she again indulged it in the city under the care of myself and Dr. Edward Sutton Smith, who had had a large experience with the drug among his patients at Mount Lebanon, Syria. She said, hashish multiplies one's life 1,000-fold. My experiences are as real as if they were ordinary events of actual life. Ah, I have the explanation. It is a recollection of my former experiences, my previous incarnations. It is a wonderful drug, and it clears up profound mysteries. Now, although the modern-day Theosophical Society denies hashish had any great influence on Blavatsky's life, admitting she may have experimented with it in her youth, but that's about the extent of it. But a number of well-known authors, as I mentioned, Benjamin Walker, Colin Wilson, and others, have thought it was relevant enough to comment on it. The Theosophists point to a couple of negative comments towards hashish Blavatsky made near the end of her life, when her health was deteriorated from chain-smoking cigarettes, and she found herself unhappily surrounded by scandal. And I'll read you one of those references that the Theosophical Society points to. This comes from the famous work of hers, Isis Unveiled. Plants also have like mystical properties in a most wonderful degree, and the secrets of the herbs of dreams and enchantments are only lost to European science, and useless to say too, are unknown to it, except in a few marked instances, such as opium and hashish. Yet the physical effects of these few upon the human system are regarded as evidence of temporary mental disorder. It's important to remember this was written at the end of her life, when she was, quite ill herself and surrounded by scandal. And many people have blamed a substance for their own personal downfall, and marijuana makes just as good a scapegoat as any. As many of us have experienced, few are as self-righteous as the reformed addict. The fact is that A.L. Rawson was one of the few lifelong friends Blavatsky had, and she herself attested to the validity of his character. In Isis Unveiled, Blavatsky makes the following comment concerning her good friend and associate, A.L. Rawson. Outside the East, we have met one initiate, and one only, who, for some reason best known to himself, does not make a secret of his initiation into the Brotherhood of Lebanon. It is a learned traveler and artist, Professor A.L. Rawson of New York City. This gentleman has passed many years in the East, 4 times visited Palestine, and has traveled to Mecca. It is safe to say that he has a priceless store of facts about the beginnings of the Christian Church, which none but one who has had free access to repositories closed against the ordinary traveler could have collected. Blavatsky goes on to quote Rawson concerning his initiation into a sect claiming secret knowledge concerning the roots of Christianity, the Druzes of Mount Lebanon. Edward Berman stated the following concerning the Druzes and the Assassins, the famous Haschisch eaters of medieval Muslim times. The Druzes' faith makes them many ways the closest of the breakaway sects of Ishmaelism to the Assassins. In The Journey to the Orient, Gerard de Nerval comments on the Druze Sheikh. The Druzes have been compared to the Pythagoreans, the Essenes, and the Gnostics, with some scholars claiming that the Knights Templar exploited many of their ideas, and the Rosicrucians and Freemasons have done the same today. Now, interestingly, this is exactly the area which some of the other people we're going to be talking about, Gerard de Nerval, for instance, who we mentioned here, they all went into this area of Lebanon, well known for its history of hashish and whatnot, and also Paschal, Beverly, Randolph, who we'll be discussing as well, also traveled into the same area. And they all seem to have been initiated into some sort of Sufi brotherhood that claims to have secret knowledge about the origins of Christianity, Gnostic knowledge. And as we've discussed over and over again on the Burning Shiva Hour, the Gnostics were definitely cannabis users. So from Blavatsky, we're going to move on to Gerard de Nerval, a famous member of the Haschisch Club. Next up on our list of hidden hash masters is the French poet Gerard de Nerval, who lived from 1808 to 1855. De Nerval was a member of the Parisian group known as the Haschisch Club, or Le Club des Haschichins, a name inspired by the nickname given to the hashish-using Ismailis, or Hashichins, where we get the same term assassin from. The club members would gather together once a month costumed with turbans and daggers. The Prince of Assassins would go from member to member with offering a spoonful of hashish with a statement, "This will be taken from your share of paradise." The elite group included some of the most famous and creative artists and authors of that time: Dumas, Hugo, Gautier, Baudelaire, Balzac, and others, and was founded by Dr. J. Moreau, an expert on the effects of hashish. There are 2 modes of existence, 2 modes of life given to man, Moreau mused. The first one results from our communication with the external world, with the universe. The second one is but the reflection of the self and is fed from its own distinct internal sources. The dream is an in-between land where the external life ends and the internal life begins. With the aid of hashish, he felt that anyone could enter into this in-between land at will. The published works of the members of the Haschisch Club are now considered classics. They extolled dignity and the freedom of the individual. Most of the members of the Haschisch Club were steeped in esoteric knowledge, and many of them wrote extensively about hashish. Dumas included in his account of Monte Cristo an encounter with the hashish-eating Sinbad the Sailor, whom he based on Hassan-I Sabah of the Hashichins. Club member de Nerval used the word supernaturalist to describe what we moderns might term high, in the following excerpt reprinted from the Book of Grass. And since you have had the prudence to cite one of the sonnets composed in the state of daydreaming the Germans call supernaturalist, you must hear them all. You will find them at the end of the volume. They are hardly more obscure than the metaphysics of Hegel or the memorabilia of Swedenborg, and would lose charm by being explained, if such things were possible. So there de Nerval is referring to the use of hashish and inspiring some of his poetry and his work. De Nerval first appeared on the French literary scene with a brilliant translation of Faust. His commentary on it revealed his vast knowledge and experience with the occult. In his classic tale, Journey to the Orient, de Nerval devoted an entire chapter to hashish in the tale of Caliph Hakim. A story set in the 10th century, he says, was related to him by a Druze sheikh named Sadi Esharazi. This tale is about a powerful Muslim, Caliph Hakim, who was in the habit of visiting the city disguised as a commoner. In one of these visits, he enters a cavern which is frequented by members of the Sabian faith, and is befriended by a young man, Yusuf, who introduced the reluctant Caliph to hashish, telling him, "This box contains the paradise promised to you by your prophet and his believers. If I weren't so scrupulous, I could soon put you into the Hori's arms without making you pass over the bridge of Asarat." After ingestion of the sacred paste, Caliph Hakim tells his newfound friend, Haschisch renders you equal to God. The two friends in de Nerval's tale were said to meet together to enjoy hashish on a number of occasions, and as Journey to the Orient tells us, their experiences included visionary doses of the drug. When both of them were deeply intoxicated by the hashish, something strange occurred. The two friends entered into a certain communion of ideas and impressions. Yusuf imagined that his companion, kicking the earth, which wasn't worthy of his glory, soared up towards the heavens, and taking him by the hand, carried him off into space amidst the whirling stars and glittering marvels of the Milky Way. Pale, but crowned by a luminous ring, Saturn increased in size as it approached them, followed by 7 moons borne along in the wake of its rapid advance. Then, but who could relate what happened when they had reached the divine home of their dreams? Human language can only reveal experiences conforming to our nature, and we must bear in mind that the two friends converged together in the celestial dream. Even the names by which they addressed each other were no longer names which are known on earth. At the end of the tale, de Nerval is told by his host, Sheikh Sadi Asarazi, that the teachings of Caliph Hakim were the foundation of the secret sect to which he belongs, the mysterious Druzes. And interestingly, these are the same sect that A.L. Rawson was initiated into, and also Blavatsky, and as we discussed, the Dr. Paschal Beverly Randolph, who will be our next topic of discussion. Now, de Nerval died pretty young. He was only like 47. He's generally thought to have been a case of suicide. He hung himself with a white silk cord. But interestingly, hanging with a white silk cord can also be indicative of a Masonic murder, according to some sources. They use a white cord in one of the rituals, and if you reveal the secrets of the society, they'll apparently hang you, or at least would in the 19th century. And de Nerval's book, in which these hashish references were discussed, Voyage to the Orient, also contains probably the most explicit account of the whole Masonic myth involving Harima Biff and Solomon and other figures. And interestingly, he says that he got this information. He relates that the story was told to him by this same Druze sheikh. And this is the Druzes is the same group that Blavatsky was initiated by in the East, according to Rawson, and also Rawson himself. And as we shall discuss, also the figure Paschal Beverly Randolph. And so maybe there was some sort of mystical hashish fraternity in the Mid-East in the 19th century. And prior to that, we know of such sects existing among Sufi groups and the assassins, who, again, we keep referring to again and again on this particular episode. So next up, we're going to take a look at Dr. Paschal Beverly Randolph. The preservation, rejuvenescence, intensification, and sanctification of love between man and woman invariably, primarily, and always did, does, and forever will depend upon the perfection of their conjunction. In plain words, upon the fullness and completeness of the conjugal union, in each case and upon both sides. The vast majority of civilized men have no endurance or staying qualities or power, but are so very morbid, a result of prostatic inflammation, that their love journey is spasmodically ended long before that of the woman has fairly begun, and the presence is scarce achieved ere the discharge takes place, whereupon all rigidity ceases, and poor she is deprived of all the joy of marital union, while compelled to endure all the legitimate and illegitimate penalties and pains consequent upon infracted natural law. For if the female is not brought, and that too by purely legitimate methods, at which not even a seraph could blush, and none but gross, coarse savages object to the natural sexual demise, the full and perfect orgasm, all of love in her is curdled and soured, and all of love for him appreciably diminished. And when it decreases from that cause, he is an idiot who expects true wifelessness at her hands. And then she, whose delicious soul ought to be wakened to the keenest sensuous symphonies, instead of being blasted, is exceedingly liable to the influence of gusts of love flowing from other directions than the nuptial or conjugal apartments. Which, if she is, he is to blame. For no man has a right to regard woman as a mere nervo-vital machine for his especial pleasure and use, for she is a magnificent instrument, capable of evolving such celestial music as will tingle the nerves of an archangel and bring delicious death to the finest nerves in all the universe. Although sounding like the words of advice from a modern sex therapist, those were in fact the words written down 150 years ago as the Ansaratic Mystery, a new revelation concerning sex by Dr. P.B. Randolph, Paschal Beverly Randolph. Randolph was a 19th century black American spiritualist, Rosicrucian, and sex magician. And a lot of what we know about Randolph is due to the work of John Patrick Devaney in this terrific book by the title of A 19th Century Black American Spiritualist, Rosicrucian, and Sex Magician, about Randolph's life and work. Not only did Randolph think that the equal orgasms of the conjugal relationship were key to marital bliss, but he said that children born from a premature ejaculating man to non-satisfied women often had bad temperament and characteristics, whereas the child conceived in a mutually orgasmic connection showed a lot more joy and compassion and stuff as a result of that conjugal relationship, and that type of imprinting took place right at that moment of birth, But as I'm going to read to you from more from John Patrick Devaney's book here, we'll find out that not only did Paschal Beverly Randolph think that sex was key to mystical delights, but other situations as well. Thus, in Randolph's medical views, human vital energy and happiness could be increased by mutual sexual fulfillment. They could also be replenished and increased by supplying the body with potions that directly replace lost or depleted vital fluids, and the supplying of these elixirs remained a large part of Randolph's work for the rest of his life. He states that in 1854 he discovered the perfection of the phospho-oxygen of Lavoisier and Humphrey Davies, the wine mentioned by Campbell in Hermippus Redificus, and by Bulwer Lytton and Hargrave Jennings, which he called it in its various formulations Phimael, Amiel, Phosphodyne, Phosphogen, Luciana cordiale, and Protozone, all of which he continued to manufacture and sell throughout his career. The specific contents of these elixirs was a closely guarded secret. Their basic active ingredient, however, is no mystery. It was hashish. Randolph says variously that he first encountered the drug in 1855 or 1856, lured by what Cahagnet wrote about the use of the narcotic agents and strengthened in the hope by what Théophile Gautier, Bayard Taylor, Fitzhugh Ludlow, and various other travelers wrote regarding the use of hashish, and that he was led to make 2 experiments with the drug and later studied it thoroughly in Egypt. He took 18 grains of the preparation and had the keenest and most beatific vision he had ever experienced. It perfectly illuminated me, but the lucidity infinitely exceeded anything I had ever known before, with no loss of will or self-consciousness. The drug changed him from an atheist into a believer. It was quite literally a revelation to him. In the early days of open enthusiasm for the drug, Randolph, as the French mesmerists had before him, found that hashish constituted the perfect food of the soul. Man was a triple being, soul, spirit, and body, and at each level he fed on the corresponding appropriate levels of food. Hashish, or rather its essence, directly fed the soul, man's highest portion. If, as Randolph says, he had been searching for years to find the wine of life, the elixir that would perfectly restore the depleted vital fluids that served to connect the soul and body, he had found it in hashish, the real secret of the wisdom tradition. As Randolph himself states, there is no doubt that Confucius, Pythagoras, and his disciples, the alchemists, Hermetists, Illuminati, and mystic brethren of all ages, used it to exalt them while making their researches for the philosopher's stone and the secret of perpetual youth, a fluid so fine as when taken to be instantly converted into vital magnetism, thus supplying all waste, repairing all effects of excess and exhaustion, reinvigorating the brain, nervous forces, and therefore restoring the vigor of the youth, and the elixir of life, a universal solvent, a fluid that will vacate the body of all morbid humors, unless let the vital forces have free action. On his return from his European and Near Eastern trip of 1857 and 1858, Randolph was regularly using hashish and experiencing wonderful visions of light, expanded consciousness, and out-of-body travel, but he was at first reluctant to mention his experiences. This changed by mid-1860 when he became an open, avowed, and enthusiastic proponent of hashish use as the royal road to clairvoyance and the replenisher of vital fluid. At one point, before the Civil War, he was probably the largest importer of hashish into the United States. His commitment is revealed in an advertisement he placed in the Banner of Light in October 1860. In reply to the numerous correspondences, let me say that nearly all the hashish I brought with me from Europe, and none other is fit to use, is exhausted. The balance I will sell at $4 a bottle, with full directions how to secure the celestial and avoid the ill fantasies. I have only 25 cases less out of 350, so that those who want the genuine Oriental article must send at once. Randolph's expression of enthusiasm for hashish, however, waxed and waned over time, as with almost every other idea he ever took up. Randolph's position on hashish and its value appeared to change from year to year, and often from edition to edition of his books, whose earlier references to hashish are later replaced by fantasia or omitted altogether. The drug becomes alternatively a dangerous and pestilent thing and a wonderful guide to clairvoyance. The overwhelming impression received from all of Randolph's accounts is that of a man already unstable from years of spirit trance, who had undergone a staggering and pivotal experience, both frightening and enlightening, from his use of hashish, and who then tried to come to grips with it for years after, all the while terrified and tantalized in turn by the drug's power. In other words, Randolph sounds like a man who had had a bad trip. His disclaimers of fear of the drug sound hollow, especially when he reveals that twice he fell under the influence of the drug accidentally. People often ask me if I use hashish, and I reply I took it twice on purpose and twice accidentally, many years ago. I have not used it since, not that I fear its powers, but because I need it not. He was certainly familiar with the drug's power, and his description of its powers sound like passages from Moreau de Tours or Fitzhugh Ludlow in advising its use for clairvoyance. He says, "Look sharp, be steady, for there's a power at work within you, capable of plunging you into thick gloom, elevating you into the bliss of paradise, and leading your soul through the shadow into regions of ineffable light, the glorious, illimitable, transcendental beauty." Passivity in the face of the drug would lead to fearful visions. It will burst upon you like the crash of 10,000 thunderers, and for hours you will be the sport of imaginations turned to realities, of the queerest, strangest, weirdest, and perhaps terrific kind. Another, and not unlikely view, is that Randolph's warnings about hashish were simply window dressings, adopted for social reasons, and that fundamentally he never lost his real enthusiasm for the drug. In 1867, he reprinted as part 2 of his Guide to Clairvoyance a treatise entitled Ecstasia, Fantasia, Hashish, and Its Uses. That is probably a reworking of the original enthusiastic pamphlet on hashish that he had published in 1860. In this, he cautions that he did not, as a rule, approve of hashish for ecstasia, fantasy, or clairvoyance, for the simple reason that it was difficult to obtain the pure article. The finer sort of true Turkish or Egyptian dawan mesk was prepared by adepts from the unripe capsules of hemp mixed with sugar, glycerin, or jelly, and were not widely available in the United States. This disclaimer was really an enticement to his readers rather than a condemnation of hashish use, because it was precisely this superior preparation of the drug that Randolph claimed to be selling under a variety of names throughout his career. In one of his last books, The New Mola, he advertised that 2 of his patent medicines, Phimiel and Amiel, provided pure forms of the drug. He touted the first especially suited for nervous exhaustion, and the second as a panacea for passional excess, onanism, etc. Together they were the best aphrodisiac in the world. He offered the elixirs for $10 to $25 a bottle, and also offered to sell physicians the recipe for Moret's granules and lozenges and his floxine, all concocted with hashish. Hashish also played a substantial role in Randolph's esoteric teachings that circulated only in manuscript. Now, Randolph lived from 1825 to 1875, and he was the illegitimate son of a white businessman and a black saloon woman. So we can see that he probably definitely suffered through the prejudices of the 19th century. In fact, he taught himself to read, taught himself a number of languages, and early on as a young teenager set sail on a boat as a cabin boy, you know, and Like de Nerval, he apparently was initiated into some of the secret brotherhoods of the Mid-East, probably the Druses or something like that. And this is where he gathered a lot of his knowledge about preparing cannabis in certain ways for mystical purposes. And also, prior to all this, Randolph was again a pivotal figure in the whole spiritualist movement, the table rappings and the seances and all that type of stuff. He would get possessed by supposed dead people and give accounts to living relatives from beyond the grave, you know, and that type of thing. But he's soon tired of that, and he's widely credited with bringing the Rosicrucian movement over to America in the 19th century. He's a grand master of the Rosicrucians in the 19th century in the United States of America. And he was initiated into the Rosicrucians while in France. Apparently in France, and that's just where he may have been introduced to hashish by a fellow named Cahagnet, who'll be next on our list. And he learned there about aspects of sexual magic as well as magical mirrors, a concave mirror that was apparently used in conjunction with large doses of hashish in order to see visions. Interestingly, some years ago, I picked up this book here based on Randolph's writing, Sexual Magic, which has instructions for the magical mirror, as well as a stimulant powder, a topical preparation that you rub on the body and temples and armpits that contained hashish, henbane, belladonna, just straight hemp and garlic and other items mixed in with fat, and a topical way, which is kind of interesting, based on apparently the old witches' ointments and whatnot. And I found that quite interesting at the time. It wasn't until I read Patrick Devaney's book, though, that I found out the extent of Paschal Randolph's involvement with hashish. Now, considering Beverly Randolph's involvement with the secret brotherhood in the Mid-East, as well as his ties with the Rosicrucian movement, here again we may have another reason why he may have, in his more overt work and publicly denounced his use of hashish, while continuing to make preparations of it and sell them to his more key students. So that's a pretty interesting guy, Paschal Beverly Randolph. Certainly a giant of a man to have done so much with his life in the 19th century, being a black man, and a real hero of mine. And next up, we're going to take a look at the guy who may have turned Paschal Beverly Randolph onto hashish, that being the French mesmerist and cabinet maker Louise Alphonse Cahagnet. Is the French mesmerist Louise Alphonse Cahagnet, who lived from 1805 to 1885. And he's widely credited with showing Paschal Beverly Randolph the wonders of hashish. Cahagnet was a real figure in the whole spiritualist movement, and even people critical of spiritualism have written things like, "In short, in the whole literature of spiritualism, I know of no records of the kind which reach a higher evidential standard, nor any in which the writer's good faith and intelligence are alike so conspicuous." That's what Podmore wrote in his Spiritualism in France before 1848 on Cahagnet, and he's actually kind of a critic of the whole spiritualism movement. Cahagnet, although he originated as a cabinet maker, he went to a lot of effort to show scientific endeavor in his experiments with hashish. And I first found out about Cahagnet in the writings of Ronald K. Siegel in his book Intoxication. Here's what Ronald K. Siegel had to say about him. While Gautier and his literary colleagues were exploring the romances of these feelings at Paris's Hashish Club, another small group of Frenchmen was using dosages of hashish 10 times greater to follow the soul's ecstatic journey out of the body into the spiritual world. Under the tutelage of psychopharmacologist Louise Alphonse Cahagnet, these subjects documented visions of death and the afterlife, experiences identical to those now known as near-death experience. The prototypical experience started with the user being pulled out of time into sacred stillness. A feeling of peace and well-being captured the soul as it separated from the body, then flung it into a bright moment of supreme happiness. Some subjects find it impossible to describe all that happens. Others describe a panoramic view of their lives, encounters with departed spirits, celestial music, and profound visions and thoughts. Geometrically sculpted images introduce themes of cosmic importance. The forms parade across the mind's eye so fast that the cherubs melt into gargoyles, then a crypt of one's own body. The blue geometric forms become towering cathedrals filled with the white light of the universal beings. The visions evaporated. Well, after I read Ronald K. Siegel's account of Cahagnet's work, I did indeed for some years search around looking for the sanctuary of spiritualism, Cahagnet's work on hashish. And luckily, after years of researching, I found what I think is probably the only English version available anyway. I don't know anybody else who has a copy. I haven't ever seen one online or anything. And luckily with a bookseller who didn't realize what a gem it was and its references to hashish. So I've got a copy of Cahagnet's book, Sanctuary of Spiritualism. And I also had found a French version prior to finding this English version, which I don't read French, so it wasn't really of that much use to me, but I held on for a while. I bought it for Mark when we were working on the museum, and we ended up selling that. It went for $750 US through another seller, so Mark only gets part of that money. But indeed, considerably more than we paid for it. But it goes to show you how much rare this type of material is and how valuable it is. So Cahagnet was interested in producing a mesmeric trance state, which he could see visions and stuff like that. And he tried a number of methods. And I'll read you a little bit from Sanctuary of Spiritualism to see just where he went with this stuff. Cahagnet writes in his Sanctuary of Spiritualism that after numerous experiments trying to ground himself electrically, attaching boxes full of earth and other items to himself, and different things, he was unable to produce any sort of somnambulistic trance. And he writes, he said, "I saw that I should have to come to the ingestion of narcotics. I had a friend, a great opium eater, who had cured himself of gastritis and a general nervous affection by this powerful narcotic. I begged him to give me a suitable dose, which he did with pleasure, while indulging in a rich description of the pictures I should see and the sensations I should experience. The dose was very weak in comparison with that taken daily by himself. He recommended me to keep near me a glass of water, acidulated with vinegar for fear of any accident. Believing, however, I should have no need of it, I took this drug hopefully, and for some time waited its effects. What was my surprise, feeling a violent headache and pain at the heart, to perceive from these symptoms that I was poisoned. I had hardly the strength to stretch out my arm to my night table on which my glass of water was deposited, and which I swallowed at a draught. My extremities were icy cold, that I could not even move them. They gave me strong water saturated with vinegar, which had a powerful diuretic effect. Another disappointment awaited me. I had a retention of urine which lasted 6 hours, during which I heartily blessed Oriental and Chinese enjoyments. I recovered from this unfortunate step, but the thirst for knowledge was not extinguishing me. A few days afterwards, when the remembrance of the dismal night was effaced, I thought I had taken too much, that acting with more prudence I should obtain other results. I smoked opium, and had a terrible headache, but being subject to headaches at that time, I thought the opium had nothing to do with it. A second time I took some, internally in a less quantity. The effects were in proportion, but of the same kind, followed by retention as before. I have known a person who, after lavement contained a few drops of laudanum, was taken on 2 different occasions with a similar retention, which confirmed my opinion that this drug acted with great activity on the bladder, and justifies me in recommending great caution in its use. I read in a work that the leaves of hemp were a powerful narcotic. I sowed some in a little garden I had at the time, and gathered from them 2 stalks, male and female, 5 feet in height. I squeezed these leaves in order to breathe their scent. I ate them in the form of salads without seasoning. Be it understood, I felt nothing from it. I thence concluded that French hemp was not so good as Egyptian hemp. I had recourse to perfumes. I burnt incense, hemp seeds, coriander, belladonna, aniseed, gum, Arabic, and gum lay. I respised these diaphoretics and perfumes with open lungs. I reaped, therefore, some violent headaches. I know not how I was able to endure all these experiments, seeing that I could not attain my object. I was beset for 3 years. My nerves had been affected by all these experiments, joined to other circumstances connected with a kind of sorcery of which my lucid Bruno had assured me I had been the victim. Cahagnet continues that some time later he made a new extract of hemp. I smoked its dry leaves and the leaves of belladonna. I inhaled sulfuric ether for 25 minutes. I obtained nothing. With perseverance, as they say, one conquers everything. One day a friend of mine announced to me that in passing the Rue des Elysiens, Comédie, he had seen at an apothecary's on a card these words, Haschisch d'Orient, preparation of hemp in the Middle East. Ah, then I felt myself at the summit of my wishes. I ran forthwith to procure myself some of this precious drug, at 50 centimes the grams, about 23 grains, although it might be rather dear to give 250 francs per pound for a few leaves of hemp and some pistaches as marmalade. The apothecary gave me a requisite information as to the method of taking this potion. I had read many descriptions of the effect of this plant, and deemed myself sufficiently instructed. I returned and appraised 2 friends of my precious discovery, and the day I intended taking this narcotic, I got 3 grams of it. We were in the midst of winter, and the chamber I lived in was very damp and cold. I give you these details, they being essential to what I shall explain to you by and by. I took these 3 grams in a cup of strong coffee, as directed. It was 2 hours after dinner. At 7:30 in the evening, I had felt nothing. My 2 friends, despairing of the success of the experiment, had gone away, leaving me plunged in the conviction that I should obtain no results. Hardly had they gone away than I drew near the hearth and gazed at it mechanically. I then experienced a nervous sensation which seemed to me to drive my eyes out of their sockets. I saw the hearth vanish from my sight to a great distance. It appeared to descend into the street, which I quickly perceived to be full of public vehicles, and the passengers who traversed it. I apprised Adele of this to me strange sight, exclaiming, "How droll it is!" I raised my legs as I walked. At each movement, I felt my feet mount up the interior of my limbs, which made me imagine that it was my inward or spiritual leg which got rid of its material envelope, as of a sheath, and mounted up indefinitely in order to quit it entirely. When this spiritual foot was in my material calf, to me that it rested upon the prolongation of this limb as upon something soft, a sponge for example. Adele was in front of me and laughed at my singular movements. So great a sympathy was then established between us that I was obliged to execute all the movements that she executed. My chin appeared to me to make only one with hers. I laughed with her laugh. I spoke with her speech. What surprised me greatly was to see myself in a vast garden, and to hear myself spoken to outside its walls. Adele addressed some questions to me, and in order to reply to them I found myself obliged to open the door. The sympathetic effect had given place to this other spiritual combination, which made me fancy myself what I looked at, and forced me naturally to hear myself spoken to as though outside that object. My voice had the effect of a distant voice that did not belong to me. The strangest thing to me was that in this garden I looked at a glass cover placed over a vegetable, and felt the conviction that I was that cover. It was the same with respect to the vegetable it covered. What amused me extremely and subsequently attracted my attention and reflection was that I thus found myself all that I looked at, and what seemed not less extraordinary, when I viewed a faggot of wood, I felt myself transformed into all the pieces that composed it. I saw outwardly the bark, and internally their veins and juices. I thus visited everything minutely, and not with a glance of observation merely. I walked at large in these same objects, which were not materially in my chamber. I had the consciousness of my entire individuality in this very narrowest pores. If my observation of details ceased, I found myself the entire object I gazed at. This peculiarity could exist only from the unity subsisting between myself and that object. It was for me what my material body is to me. I was it, and it was me. These phenomena demonstrated to me that these hallucinations, so called by all those who have taken this beverage, and on whom similar effects have been produced, were intended to establish sacred truths, especially by directing towards them the serious observation of all studious men, and might be deemed fully sufficient to prove that we can be all and in all. Cahagnet was so impressed by the effects he received from hashish that he went on to initiate 15 other individuals into its use, giving them 3 grams in a cup of coffee at each setting. And sometime later, after this experimentation and the results he obtained from that, he wrote that, "Does not a medicine exist which I dare only whisper to you, which is that of the Word, the living Word, which says, Let that be, and that is, the medicine of the Christs, of the saints, a medicine, the virtue of which may even be included in the mere name of a plant. I have offered to your view very precious jewels. Learn to appreciate them, and may the Lord be with you. In the state produced by hashish, you are the thing itself to which you direct your attention. You are so at the time you wish. You may, therefore, be changed or see changed into a tree, a rock, an animal, anything whatsoever on which this false observation is brought to bear. And there is no difficulty in this, since spiritually all these things are a particle of your being, one of the millions of thoughts of which it is composed. Substitute one of these thoughts for your own individuality or for that which you may desire, and you will believe yourself to be what is represented by the thought by which you would desire to be replaced, swayed, unindividualized, shall I call it. But let healthy observation come to your aid. You will quickly perceive that you and the governing thoughts makes two in one. Supposing the agents were able to enter into this state naturally or artificially, in which they discern this mass of sensations and forms, past, present, and future, which man is capable of feeling, assuming, or perceiving, they will have inferred from it what we passed materially through this series of states, and have thence created the system of the metempsychosis. Finally, in his conclusions of Sanctuary of Spiritualism, Cahagnet writes, I have perceived that this substance has no other effect than to increase morally and physically the faculties of man. Everyone will be able to appreciate this state sufficiently not to allow it to become a habit, which might be very injurious. Those who have been intoxicated may yet have reason enough not to become drunkards. It ought to be the same with inquiring men. It would be studying to very bad purpose to march it onward to madness and stupefaction, which would be the result of this ecstatic intoxication if induced without reason or limitation. To use it 3 or 4 times a year is sufficient for a prudent man to keep steadily his path without accidents. Otherwise, I would no more answer for his reason than that for of all other men of violent and unbridled passions. Now, in respect to Cahagnet's comment, only 3 or 4 times a year, it's important to remember that they were doing 3 grams of hashish at each sitting. So this was more of an entheogenic or psychedelic dose of hashish than what type of effect you could get from smoking the drug. And I'm not really familiar with anything by Cahagnet that indicates that he had used cannabis in that more milder way. Now, from Cahagnet, we move on to our last figure in our 19th century occult hash heads. And he's actually kind of at the beginning of the 20th century. The book that I'm going to be referring to is from 1907. And this is T.W. Coakley. And it's more the characters in his book that are of interest to us than Coakley himself. I don't really know too much about Coakley, but the storyline in Keep, A Life Story in 9 Phases, is so similar to the details of these other people's lives, I thought I'd conclude with it. And it's such a nifty looking book as well. Now, in Coakley's Keep, A Life Story in 9 Phases, tells a story of an artist by the name of Leon Abacus, who strives to be a great artist, but although he's a good illustrator and stuff like that, his work lacks the touch of genius than the works of, say, Rembrandt or Da Vinci. And this is something that he really strives to overcome. And he feels it's like an element of imagination or creativity that's just out of reach from at the present time. And so he begins to experiment with a number of substances. In a chapter on page 23 of the book, The Science of Intoxication, we read of Abacus's experiments with certain substances in order to achieve this element of genius. In the privacy of my apartments, under the watchful care of the unquestioning eye of my manservant Hassan, I started on a series of experiments which lasted for several months. I tried in turn thoroughly, under all sorts of physical conditions, the effects of alcohol, abstinence, cocaine, and opium, all to no purpose. Alcohol, used in light doses, was powerless to help me. When taken freely, it produced an exhilaration altogether too feverish to be valuable, and soon succeeded by uneasy delirium, with subsequent stupor. Absinthe and cocaine produced in me a kind of mental paralysis. Opium I used in various forms, and for a time I flattered myself that I had found the wonder-working agency for which I was searching. But this drug proved as disappointing as its fellows. I abandoned it when I had fully satisfied myself that its powers was confined to the stimulation of the grosser of the imagination. I can understand how the metaphysical mind of the English opium eater found in the drug a wealth of sensuous imagery which reinforced and illumined the severe beauties of his thought. But I needed no such stimulus. There was no lack of sensuousness in my tropical nature. What I sought to quicken and develop was the higher soul faculty, the germ of the spirituality which informs and vivifies every true work of art. I had succeeded, not without a struggle, in escaping from the domination of the drugs which I have enumerated, and I was about to dip into the pharmacopoeia with a view to experimenting still further, when a chance, or should I say a preordained happening, altered the course of my investigations. One night I drifted into a tobacconist's shop near Union Square. I was about to buy a package of cigarettes when I was struck by the strangely familiar look which the place bore. The shop consisted of one long room, the farther portions of which was veiled from view by a curtain of red fustian. As I entered, the drapery was thrust aside, and a lean, sallow-faced fellow with Semitic features stepped beside the counter to wait on me. At the same moment, a delicate yet pungent aroma saluted my nostrils and quickened my memory with the suggestive force peculiar to a familiar odor. It was the subtle and unmistakable incense of keef. This unexpected meeting with the Moorish drug filled me on an instant with new hope. Keef, the very thing. Why had I not thought of it before? By reason, probably, of my long acquaintance with its use. Civilized man is prone to adopt the obvious and natural mode of procedure only after he has exhausted his ingenuity in following fruitlessly more recondite methods. I turned to the tobacconist and addressed him unhesitatingly in the jargon of Arabic and Spanish, which is the current speech in the streets of Tangiers. He replied in the same tongue, and with eager effusiveness of the exile who meets with a fellow countryman. His name, he told me, was a Bennetul, a patronymic as well known to me as was mine to the tobacconist. The little world within the walls of Tangiers is not so wide, but by the family name will be recognized by a son of the sacred city, even though he may fail to identify the man who bears it. Without loss of time, I communicated to my newfound acquaintance my desire to indulge in keef, and I was at once cordially invited to join him in a pipe. He led me into his retreat behind the turkey red hangings, where I was duly presented by two compatriots who, like my host, were tabacareros. The nook in which I found myself was furnished faithfully in Moorish style, and with decorative effects that were quite surprising in the view of the commonplace characters of its occupants. Huge shields of hammered brass shone flame-like on the tapestried walls. A massive bronze lantern suspended by a brazen chain dangled from the ceilings. Rugs of picturesque patterns through Coruscant fabric littered the floor, and here and there were ottomans covered with a mosaic of stained leather. In the center of the room stood a table lying on which were several red-stemmed pipes of red clay. These two, heaped in the middle of the board and gleaming duskily in the lantern of light, with the metallic luster of a miser's treasure, lay a quantity of Indian hemp. One of my host's visitors was indolently stripping the yellow grass leaves from their parent twigs and powdering them between his brown palms. His companion puffed at a keef pipe with tranquil complacency, stopping now and then to mix the powdered herb with portions of fine-cut Havana leaf. A pack of well-thumbed napes, the playing cards of the Spanish, stared face upward from the table. I had been so long severed in spirit as well as body from the old life of Tangiers that this recurrence to the scenes of my dreamy boyhood was a rich treat for me. And when my host brought forth from some mysterious recess a pot of steaming black coffee, I was only too ready to throw myself on an ottoman and join in the feast. It may have been due to my haphazard contact with an environment which renewed the memories of my youth. It may have been due to the subtle influence of the keef fumes unconsciously inhaled, but to whatever the effect may be attributed, I felt that I was about to enter a new sphere of existence. I eyed Bennetul intently as he proceeded with solemn Eastern courtesy to prepare a pipe with its fragrant charge, and I could not have experienced a greater awe if he were some mighty hypnotist working a spell with which to snare my soul. I remember strangely, and as one remembers a long-gone sweet experience, the succeeding happenings of that night. I know that there passed a period of lazy contemplation. We chatted of Tangiers, and I saw its tangled streets and sunlit walls in the azure cloud which I blew from my first keef pipe. I smoked immoderately, and my mood merged after a while into one of divine merriment. My matter-of-fact associates disclosed to me the most heroic qualities. Their gossip was the loftiest sentiments, their dull bardage the sublimest wit. Their mirth was as the laughter of the gods. I could not but share in it, and count myself an Olympian too. I remember, not indistinctly, yet remotely, seeking my bachelor home and threading my way through the streets of the great city with a rare sense of exaltation, and in a mood which lent to the meanest of objects in regal grace and ideal charm. The town to me was a metropolis of fairyland. The electric stars which glistened along the prosaic thoroughfare, I knew it at sight for the elemental lightings harnessed by the genius of humanity. I looked on the great buildings towering dizzily skyward, and learned that mortal man, as in the olden myth, still labors to scale high heavens. Here was a romance of architecture fresher and truer than that which clothes ancestral palaces, mosques, and castellated piles. The horseless car shammed in the triumphal chariot of Caesar. The workaday mob of passerbyers were my brothers now, a radiant company of immortals, and the wan and shriveled sandwich man who jostled me as he went by was no shabby toiler of the slums, but a noble spirit in whose face I read the record of a tragic duel with fate. Arrived at my room, I yielded to the insistent influence of the drug and fell into a fitful slumber, interspersed with the glory of great thoughts and cheerful sentiments. Then came a period of vague suggestion, an uplifting of the heart, a painting after the sweet waters of the fountains of the ideal and the unknown, an undefined attraction towards some mysterious affinity, a period when I felt that I knew that there was some puissant entity seeking to reach and act upon my life, and while seeking to fathom the problem, I was envisioned by distracting dreams and begulfed into oblivion. My first experience of the witchery of keef delighted and gratified me beyond expression. I was satisfied that at last I had realized in some measure the dream with which I had solaced myself for months back, that I had found the long-sought key to the treasure house of ideals. Without so much as a scruple as to its ultimate effect upon my physical and mental being, I surrendered myself to the alluring influence of the drug. The spell it wrought was essentially different from the effects obtained by the use of any of the other agencies with which I had hitherto experimented. In the condition induced by keef, there was nothing of alcoholic fever, nothing of the gross gratification which opium eaters know. So far from relating to animal delights, the pleasure experienced was distinctively moral. In the keef dream, the physical self was lulled into a state of unperturbed rest, while the higher mental faculties were stimulated to abnormal activity. The senses found nirvana, the soul in enfranchisement, the zest that gratified ambition brings, the intoxication of the orator buoyed up upon a sea of plaudits, the divine delirium of the poet, the ecstasy of the great captain who hears the huzzas of his triumphant legions. These were the raptures which keef awarded to its votary. On the day following my first keef dream, I visited Bentuil's and procured a store of the drug, for I found myself already longing to smoke with uncontrollable desire. To be sure, I had not as yet the acquired appetite which enslaves the habitual smoker, but I had no less potent motive in the belief that the drug was an instrument through which I could stimulate my imagination to such an extent as to realize on canvas the visions which had been dimly and momentarily foreshadowed to my spirits. I was not long in discovering that the mystic effects of the drug was marked by 3 successive stages, which could be differentiated from one another without difficulty. The first stage was a languorous reverie in which all the material cares were eliminated from life, and the mind, freed from the tasks and distractions of the sordid world, floated calmly and reposefully along pleasing channels of thought. As the drug gained in power, this phase was followed by that of fantasy. Here the mind took a note of the phenomena of the physical universe with a truer and subtler apprehension than normally. The precipitant discovered something of the beautiful in all things, interpreted nature and art alike with unfailing cheerfulness, and grasped instinctively the dignity of life and all the finer joys and truths of existence. Finally, there came the exaltation of spirit to which I have already alluded and which undoubtedly constituted the chief charm of the drug. This was a state in which the mind seemed from the nons in full accord with the infinite, in which time and space, pain and remorse, misgiving and satiety were blotted out in one supreme ecstatic sense of being. This culminating stage was succeeded all too quickly by a coma-like sleep. In due time, I learned that the phenomena, both in the state of fantasy and the ecstasy, were perceptibly affected by the mood in which I found myself when setting out to smoke. This was so true that I studied to put myself in a responsive frame of mind and on a high plane of thought before wooing the drug. I usually sought the pipe after protracted meditation upon the high philosophies, or when fresh from poring over the splendid pages of the world's greatest poets. In this way I found that by saturating my imagination with a drama of Shakespeare's or Calderon's, or a limerick of Omar Khayyam's, or one of Emerson's essays, I could not only map out in part the trend of my fantasies, but could even lend color to the ecstatic stage of the Keef trance. I saw to it also that my material environment was as such to suggest and sustain a lofty train of thought. The appointment of my Keef chamber, while they partook of oriental luxury, were marked by the intellectual and refined taste of the Saracenic era and had nothing in common with the grosser forms and fleshy coloring of the Turkish school. Well, the story continues that the artist Leon Abakasis begins to paint under the influence of Keef, and indeed creates this painting of a woman which is so fabulous that he feels in league with the genius of the arts of previous eras. And the story carries on that he begins to develop quite a reputation as an artist, and he's approached by a very wealthy but kind of snobby art collector to paint a portrait of his wife. And so Abakasis goes over to meet the guy's wife, and lo and behold, she's the same woman in the painting that he's painting that is a work of genius that he's been hiding from everybody. And it turns out she's been having fits of hysteria where she faints and remains unconscious for some periods of time, and these coincide with the exact times that he's painting. And he begins this whole astral plane love affair with this woman that is kind of the basis of the book. So it's kind of fascinating that Haschisch in Keef, A Life Story in 9 Phases, is not only accredited with giving the guy a creative edge in his art and stuff like that, but he begins this incredible astral love affair with another man's wife. It ends up kind of tragic and stuff, but it's a fascinating little book, and definitely the cherry in my own book collection regarding cannabis and hashish. Well, that about brings this edition of Burning Shiva to an end, the hidden story of the 19th century hash masters. And as it says in Keef, A Life Story in 9 Phases, Bismillah, blessed be Keef.